Hello and welcome. I just began the recording. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and welcome to Sinister Wisdom's celebration of genealogies of Jewish lesbian novels. We have such a great evening, so I'm going to talk super fast to get us to the really fun part of the evening. My name is Julie Enzer. I am thrilled to be here after a hurricane hiatus, which kept me away from some of our events. I want to thank especially Max Bacher and Yeva Johnson, who filled in for me while I was gone and did a smashing job with our events, demonstrating that Sinister Wisdom is much, much more than one person. I also want to note for everyone this evening that as you were coming in, we were playing a bit of the song Angry at This. That's Atthis by Maxine Feldman. It's a new song that we were sharing as people were coming in this evening because we wanted to make tonight a little more Jewy and a little more queer. And I was thinking during the day that Maxine Feldman is the perfect person to do that. So welcome. As we begin, it is our custom to spend a moment on a land acknowledgement. In the United States and around the world, many of us are living on occupied, unceded land. I am in what is now Dover, Florida, traditional homelands and territories of the Seminole. I invite you to insert into the chat your location and acknowledge the land on which you live. As we think about colonialism in our own countries, I know many of us also think about the ongoing conflict and war in the Middle East, particularly as the war escalates. In this moment, I invite us all to pause in solidarity with all people who are mourning the loss of life, all who are awaiting the return of hostages, detainees, and political prisoners, and for an end to occupation. May we all raise our voices for peace, and as importantly, may we dedicate labor to achieve it. So I'm excited to welcome you this evening, and this event is co-sponsored by the Jewish Women's Archive. You'll be hearing a little bit later from Betsy Moore about that. I wanted to do an event this month on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Alana Dykewoman's Riverfinger Women. Riverfinger Women, published by Daughters Publishing Company, Inc., was an early novel of the women's liberation movement that wrote positive endings for lesbians. Given that Alana was an important previous editor of Sinister Wisdom and a beloved friend and supporter of the journal, I wanted to mark the 50th anniversary of her novel by doing what I hope you all see as a hallmark of Sinister Wisdom's work, honoring the lesbian feminist past and making it part of vibrant contemporary conversations. Tonight, we think about Alana's work in Riverfinger Women and overall put her work into continuing conversations about Jewish lesbians and genealogies of Jewish lesbian novels. I also want to note that today, October 29th, is the 8th yahrzeit of Susan Levenkind. Susan was Alana's partner, a staunch Sinister Wisdom supporter, and a beloved manager of our business operations for many years. Her memory is a blessing to us all. A brief word about Sinister Wisdom, though I know looking at the audience, many of you already know the work that we do. We're a quarterly journal of lesbian literature and art. We began in 1976 and have been publishing consistently since then. If you are not a current subscriber, please do subscribe. This is our current issue, Lives of Common Lesbians. We did a great launch the other week that Yeva Johnson hosted, and that's available on our YouTube channel. If you're able, monthly sustainers are crucial to the organization. If you can give monthly, I invite you to sign up as a sustainer at sinisterwisdom.org/sustainers. We send out emails every month when your gift comes in with behind the scenes details and new information about what we have coming for the journal. I also want to remind everybody about the Sinister Wisdom 2025 calendar. It's 8.5 by 11 this year. It's now in stock, winging its way to folks who've ordered it in advance, and all monthly sustainers have received it. If you become a monthly sustainer, you'll receive a calendar for free. You can also order a copy and order copies as gifts at our website, sinisterwisdom.org/calendars. One calendar is $20, 5 calendars are $75. It's gorgeous, fabulous original lesbian artwork all throughout it, and I would love to share it with you. Now, as I've mentioned, I'd like to invite Betsy Moore, the Director of Programs from the Jewish Women's Archive, to tell us a bit about JWA and welcome you all to the event. Betsy.
Thank you so much. My name is Betsy Moore. I am the Director of Programs at the Jewish Women's Archive. And I, first of all, just want to thank Julie and Sinister Wisdom for including us in this event. I'm so thrilled and delighted to be here. And it's especially exciting since we have a new entry about Ilana Dykwoman in our encyclopedia, which I believe will get shared in the chat, and I invite you to peruse at your leisure. Um, I just want to say a little bit about who we are for those who might not be familiar, although I certainly see some familiar faces in the audience, which is always a delight and a pleasure. The Jewish Women's Archive is a digital archive that expands and transforms the way we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories and non-binary people's stories, and paying attention to how gender and sexuality function in the past and present. We believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps us create a better world. We offer regular virtual programming of our own, in addition to partnering with amazing organizations like Sinister Wisdom, online history courses, film clubs, and book talks. We have one coming up starting in mid-November on the history of Jewish women's activism, which we hope will be timely and inspiring. I invite everyone to check that out. I can put a link in the chat in a moment. And these are just one aspect of our work, in addition to our podcast, our encyclopedia, our newsletters, our blog, our teen fellowship program. And I hope you will check out jwa.org to explore the full range of projects that we offer. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Betsy. We were thrilled to have you be a part of this event. And I'm so happy with that you all included a biographical entry on Ilana Dykwoman at the Jewish Women's Archive. That is available in the chat, and I encourage everyone to check it out, and definitely send all of your comments and critiques and corrections to the author. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Do keep your microphone muted throughout the program. If we detect noise from you, we will mute you. As we proceed, if you want to show appreciation for readers, feel free to wave your hands at the end of conversations, use reaction emojis on Zoom, and light up the chat. Sometimes some of the best things happening at our events are happening in the chat. We will also make the chat available as a part of the archive program on our website. If you need technical assistance, Max or Jules are on tap. They're labeled as co-hosts and should be at the top of your program, the top of your screen. You can chat with them individually with any technical assistance help that you need. And as you all heard, we are recording the event, and we'll make it available tomorrow or Thursday at sinisterwisdom.org/SW134. So you can look for it there. Everyone who's registered will receive an email also with a direct link to where to watch the video. We have an hour planned for our program this evening, with plans to wrap up at the top of the hour, 8 p.m. on the East Coast, including time for our traditional dance number at the end. All right, now we start the good stuff. We have 4 fantastic panelists for this event that I'm excited to have them come together, answer some questions, be in dialogue with one another. And to give us the very most amount of time to talk about our topic, Jewish lesbian novels and genealogies, we are going to drop their bios into the chat, and I will just introduce them by name. Also, for the ease of our Zoom conversation, I've told them for the first 3 questions, I'll call on panelists to keep things moving along. We're going in order by age, first from the youngest to the oldest, then the oldest to the youngest, and we'll keep flip-flopping like that as the night goes on. I assume you'll all catch on as we move through it. So please join me in welcoming our 4 panelists, Ellen Galford, Judith Katz, Sarah Schulman, and Sam Cohen. Welcome all. It's great to see you. I'm so glad you're here. We're just waiting for Sam to be pinned. We were talking before, as everyone was in the waiting room, about the different ways that people know one another or don't know one another, know each other only on the page or by reputation. So I want to just sort of acknowledge that we all have different relationships in the room. And I want to launch right in with asking Sam to start, and then we'll move up the age chain. Sam, what novels by Jewish lesbians or Jewish women or Jewish people were formative for you in your work as a novelist? And kind of related, were you aware of entering a tradition of Jewish lesbian novelists?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Julie, for having me, and Sinister Wisdom for having me. And I'm so honored to be the youngest in the room. And I think now that everyone is coming in, I want to say that there was this writer, Lesbian Newman, whose book I was working on publishing as an intern when I was in college. And I think just seeing Yiddish and lesbian desire in the same place like blew my mind open. And that was kind of like the first thing that made me feel like it was possible to be a Jewish lesbian. And I also feel really indebted to Jewish queer writers who are not necessarily novelists, like Shulamith Firestone, Judith Butler, Andrea Dworkin, people who were really looking at everything that was supposed to be natural and biological and saying, no, actually, this is constructed. And that feels like the ground from which I write a lot of my fiction. And I think it's both a very Jewish and a very lesbian pose to be able to kind of look at the world from the outside and think about its themes and how it's put together the way it is. Also wanted to name Leslie Feinberg, who I think is the first writer that really made me think about how it's possible to write into a way of being that doesn't exist yet and become something that you haven't seen. And also Marge Piercy, who is also a Jewish woman from Detroit like me, and who in Women on the Edge of Time imagined ends to so many violent systems, extraction from the earth, the gender system, the carceral system. And I feel like I always have kind of like one finger in that world, and I'm always writing like a little bit from that. I think I'm much more aware of coming from a queer tradition than from a Jewish tradition. I think queer, like I'm writing to queer people and reading mostly queer writers. And when my book Sarah Land came out, I was so supported by Jewish organizations and had so many Jewish readers reaching out to me. And I thought I was kind of like calling out the Jews and trying to move away from Jewish identity and into queerness. And I kind of had to face that maybe it was actually part of Jewish experience to feel really beleaguered and besieged by the Jews and be like trying to person and being always kind of like funneled back into it. And so now I'm kind of aware of being part of a Jewish lineage of writers.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sam. Sarah,
I'm really the third youngest person. Okay. Well, the first Jewish lesbian character that I remember was in a book called Looking for Rachel Wallace by Robert Parker. He had a detective named Spencer, and he was assigned to protect a lesbian feminist. And it was this woman, Rachel Wallace, who was a kind of an Andrea Dworkin type. So that's actually the first character I was exposed to. The OG, Elena Dykewoman, I actually met her when my girlfriend at the time, Stephanie Roth, and I were in Ocento in San Francisco, and we saw a notice that somebody was looking for 2 lesbians to help them move to Women's Land in Coos Bay, Oregon. So we took the job, and it was Alana, and we moved all her stuff up there. And I remember she gave her dog filtered water, and she called men weenies. That was my first exposure to her. I was introduced to her books by Karen London at Woman Books, and they were on a shelf that said to be read and shared by lesbians only. So that's me.
That's great. Thanks, Sarah. Judith?
Well, let me see. First, I'll say that I was living with Ilana Dykewoman as a roommate while she was working on River Fringer Women. That Sarah, your book, the Sophie Horowitz story, was probably one of the incentives for me to have permission to go ahead and write my story in a different way than yours, but still, I was inspired by that book. And then eventually I got to read Ellen's book, The Dyke and the Dybbuk. And then Julie turned me on to Sam, your Sarah Lynn stories, which I thought were amazing. It just like freaked me out and amused me very much that I could identify with these characters that were written by somebody quite a bit younger than me. And that was really fun. But while I was trying to figure out how to write about Jewish lesbians, I also was trying to find Jewish voices. So I don't think Antia Zerska was probably, well, she might have been a lesbian, but probably wasn't. And her book, The Bread Givers, was an inspiration about language. And then there's a woman named Debbie Britzman who was living in Northampton when I was living there, who was like, Judith, you got to read like these guys. Shimon Grady, you got to read him. You got to really read the other singer guy. You gotta, so and then I started reading books by writers of color also, because it felt to me like it was important to write lesbian stories. I wanted to write about Jewish lesbians. I wanted to write about people Jewish lesbians who felt like real Jews in a lesbian community and real lesbians in a family. And I also wanted to try to find an authentic voice. And so I looked to those other writers. So, and what I guess I also really want to say is I do owe a debt to both Ellen and Sarah. And Sam, you being kind of a good inspiration for me as I go forward into my 70s to try to be a better writer of stuff that people can identify with. That's it.
Thanks, Judith. Ellen?
Okay, well, when I started out, I mean, I was born in the first half of the 20th century. So, just by a bit. And so I had to first clear away all the horrendous stereotypes, scary gym teachers, murderous villainesses in movies. I mean, there were only negative images. And so it took me quite a while to figure out who I was. I left the United States in 1971 to live in Scotland and then in London and then back in Scotland. And, I've only ever come back in a way to visit family or to be once a very excited foreign tourist in the Castro in San Francisco, where my partner and I saw, there were people who could hold hands in the street. They were the same sex. So I guess I was a late starter, probably both in coming out and also in writing fiction. I had been deeply put off when I was a student at Bennington. The late Bernard Malamud, who I had adored as a high school reader, was teaching us creative writing. And I think somehow he managed to kind of put me off for about the next 15 years. That's another story. So when I was really spent a lot of the time just dyke hunting in general. And the lesbians one was aware of, okay, there was Sappho and there was Stein and Toklas, who, it took a long time later to realize that their politics were perhaps sort of iffy, and that they were highly privileged, but A, they were two women who lived together, and B, they were Jewish, and C, they loved good food. So I felt very sort of connected, and it was quite disappointing later when you started thinking about issues of class and issues of where people stood in terms of early to mid 20th century politics. So there were sort of two strands. I spent a lot of time trying to get away from the very nice, very respectable New Jersey Jewish reform world and the compulsory heterosexuality of it. And, so I was very, very identified with the women in my family, fabulous aunties and great aunts and things. So it took a while to start finding the books. So for me, the earliest, there were the Jewish strands and the lesbian strands. And I have to say, and people here are going to be sick about this, but the most influential Jewish writers at the beginning, Philip Roth. Because after all, I grew up in the Newark Jewish community that in the way of white flight of the early 50s, people moved their kids up the hills into the New Jersey suburbs. So that was the world that Roth was writing about. But he was so fiendishly, he was so wonderfully satirical. He was absolutely scandalous. I mean, we hadn't, his level of sexism, ultimately, a few books later, I was sort of throwing them against the wall, excommunicating him forever. But it was that wonderful sense of being able to stand back and look at the world you came from satirically, fantastically, really take the piss out of, rabbis who pronounce the word God with 5 syllables. And he was writing about Jewish Newark and its suburbs. So, he was important to me. Allen Ginsberg, another nice New Jersey boy, was also important because of that huge, weak way, we're quiet. Right, absolutely. Or as my grandmother said, weak work high school. It was there. It's a little world just over the Hudson from the big world of Jewish New York, and so those two, in a way, it was the wicked pleasures, and it was the distancing, and it was the lack of fear they had in some ways about the sort of scandalizing of where they came from. So the strands I had, as I say, the prehistory, you had Stein and Toklas, so the hope that somewhere back there were people who would give us a foothold into this world. So mainly when I would come back and visit my family every couple of years, and it was just the beginning of consciously lesbian feminist lit. So I'd come over to the States, go into New York City on the bus and get things like Patience and Sarah, and that wonderful notion that you could look into the past and here was this this lesbian couple. So there was a lot more going on from your side, and we had customs was not very helpful about when we did start having radical bookshops and feminist bookshops in the UK. They were tortured by they'd get deliveries of things or customs would have torn them apart or refused them. So but there were things were happening. We began to have our kind of our own lesbian literature, and particularly for Jewish lesbian literature, thanks to 2 American Jewish expats in London. We had Only Women Press, which was, where women were printers, women were publishers, and they, Lillian Moen, who founded it, and Sheila Shulman, who later became Rabbi Sheila Shulman, who was probably the first out lesbian rabbi. And she was a great inspiration, even to a completely agnostic heretic like me. So, you felt like you were the beginning of a tradition being born. And I had been from the start, non-Zionist family, not, Israel was not a thing, except not in my name, and lefty, lesbian. But I was kind of in the 80s, got very curious and felt, I know I need to reconnect with this. So, it's a kind of an overlapping world of, as I was I'd found my lesbian self and my non-compulsory heterosexuality self in the 70s. And I really didn't start finding my writing voice until the 80s. So
that's great. So Ellen, because you're going to speak first next, I want to pose the next question because I feel like that's the part what you said is
okay. Well, I hope I'm not blethering on too long. I promise I'll be really short at the end.
Okay, so the next thing that I want to ask each of our 4 panelists to think about and tell us a little bit about is about your process as writers. What do you see yourself doing as a Jewish lesbian writer? Do you, and if so, how do you think about including Jewish themes in your novels? What draws you to them, and what sustains you in writing about Jewish themes?
Well, some of it, I would say, it's I have to say, a lot of fiction for me, particularly long form fiction, it has kind of become past tense rather than present tense. As I've gotten much older, life is too short. So I've kind of reverted to poetry. You know, not that it doesn't take a little time, but it's been a long time since I've written long form fiction. But what did sustain me, I suppose, there was that period when it was the We Are Here of lesbian identity, that, you know, that it was kosher in a very deep way to be lesbian, and something I could be proud of. But I think probably over time the Jewishness started foregrounding, and the lesbianness kind of moved back the way. So I think probably my recent writing, some of which is, you know, poetry and miscellaneous kind of pieces for like words and music performances and things like that, it's the Jewishness where it starts, and the lesbianness is kind of a given. But rather than, you know, I think where the feeding goes, I mean, in a way, the Dyson book was a kind of identity crisis novel. I was living in North London, in the next door bit to where all the Haredi lived, in Stamford Hill. And I suddenly found I was very drawn to, you know, we'd go over to Safeways to buy, you know, in Stamford Hill, I mean, on a Friday, my partner and I'd see, you know, the guys in the big strimmels and their little boys usually on their way to Shabbos and that sort of thing. And I began to get feeling really connected, in spite of the fact that is definitely not the ancestry that I came out of. And so in a way, I suppose in the last, well, probably this century, anything I've written really, it started with the Jewish thing, where I suppose maybe the lesbian sense, it's me writing, but it's not been really primary content for a long time. So it's not that I would say never, never again, but it's just, there was a kind of swing round, because I felt there was a place for me inside the Jewish cultural context and the Jewish timeline. And I guess I feel more secure about the safety of the lesbian world in a strange way than I do about the Jewish world, which is, you know, I mean, there are Yiddish words for it, but it's a bit verdreht at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ellen. What about you, Judith?
Well, I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm kind of coming back into writing in a serious way after a series of health problems that have sort of made my brain cotton candy. But, you know, I've been trying to figure out and study more about how to write about the kind of rotten roots of the whole Palestine-Israel project historically, which led me to be reading Daniel Deronda this summer, because I had read a nonfiction book where someone explained that the British guy that had the great idea to start like a Jewish state had read Daniel Deronda and got real excited. And so I thought, I didn't read the whole thing. I tried to find those parts. Anyway, it feels like for me, it's a lot about writing about lesbians, but also writing as a Jewish person. And the strange thing that's happened is the characters from the two novels that I've already written have reactivated in different ways. And one is a more contemporary, or not even contemporary. I have to start reminding myself that 1980 is like historical. But to write about, in certain ways, fictionalize or maybe not fictionalize the Women's Pentagon action and the activism that was happening in the 1980s. That's one project. And then the characters from the Escape Artists may find themselves in Palestine and the beginning of that project. And I'm talking about the colonization part of the project, the pioneer part of the project. So that's kind of what I've been working on and reading about. And also I've been, I had a very kind of sci-fi medical procedure that began right at the exact same time as the Israel-Palestine war started, like about 2 days after the Hamas invasion, and then the next day after Netanyahu started blasting Gaza. So I just have been sort of writing about that whole experience and about how weird that is. And I'm kind of calling it Am I Bionic? But it's really is about being Jewish at this time and being a Jewish dyke at this time. And what is my job? I mean, what is my job as a writer? What is my job as an activist? I'm not teaching anymore. What does that mean? Etc. That's it.
Thanks, Judith. Sarah?
Well, I think it's been different for me for fiction and nonfiction. So in terms of nonfiction, I've written quite a bit about Palestine. In 2011, I published a book called Israel, Palestine, and the Queer International.
Mhm.
A lot about the beginning of the Palestinian queer movement. And then in 2014, I had a book, Conflict is Not Abuse, that was built around the 2014 aerial bombing of Gaza. And now I have a new book coming out April 22nd. It's called The Fantasy and Necessity of Solidarity. And it's, you know, solidarity involves a lot of fantasy, right? If you're the person asking for solidarity, you want people to help you, even if it's not immediately in their best interest. And if you're the person offering solidarity, you think it's going to be at no cost, and you're going to be very effective. So just trying to break those things down and make it sound less heroic so that it can be more possible. With lots of examples of, it's framed around Palestine, but lots of examples of other movements and really interesting, weird things that people have done that kind of work a little because it never really completely works. In fiction, I have a novel I haven't been able to publish. It's called The Cure and the Cause. And it's about two Jewish families in 1958 who are on either sides of the psychiatric debate around healing, because 1958 is the year of the first antidepressant, and how the European refugees who were psychoanalysts believed that people heal in relationship. The Americans for whom psychoanalysis was a mass project and not an elite project, really were relying on medication because they had so many people to treat. So it's about that, and it's very personal. And, you know, publishing has changed quite a bit. So certain kinds of lesbian content at this point are very, very, very hard to publish, extremely hard. If you're a stylist and you're interested in male power, which I'm very fascinated by, and you have lesbian adult protagonists, it's pretty hard to get published right now, but I'm not giving up. And then in terms of like citizenship, I'm on the advisory board of Jewish Voice for Peace. I've been on it since 2010. I'm faculty advisor to Jewish Voice for Peace on my campus, which is now Northwestern. And I'm living in this every day. And, it's completely transformed Jewish identity and perspective, and who we are in the world has completely changed. 1958, I never could have imagined that Jews could occupy this social role. And it's something we all have to face.
Thank you, Sarah. Sam?
Well, thank you, Sarah, for your work. I think it's probably shaped the thinking of everyone in this Zoom. I don't know, I wasn't necessarily thinking about writing about Palestine when I was thinking about this question. But I think it's kind of starting to seep into my current project because it's just so present. And I think in terms of non-writing things, I was at Oberlin last year, and the students started just Oberlin Jews for Palestine, which was just mostly ritual and mostly learning spaces. And so I really showed up in those and was very interested in how they were reshaping Judaism and Jewish practice outside of the Zionist institutions on campus. And then, I think as a writer, I think your original question was like if we're trying to write about Jewish themes and how we're doing that. And I think that, like I said, it's like queerness is always aspirational for me, and Jewishness is kind of the thing that I can't get away from and just kind of seeps into everything. I'm from the Midwest, and I think something about being from a Jewish town in the Midwest is that no one leaves the town. And so sort of everyone you know is Jewish, and that's the kind of person that there is. And that's the sensibility, and that's the humor, and that's the emotional attachment style and communication style. And so I think that when I am thinking about people, I'm just often thinking about Jewish people. And then I'm also questioning sort of like, what is this? Like, what are Jewish people? Because for so long, this was just what people were to me. And so thinking about us too in relation to other kinds of people. And I don't know, I think I'll stop there and yeah.
Okay, you start off the next round. And I think for time, I have 3 questions left, and I think I'm going to skip the middle one here for time purposes. And I'm going to ask you each to talk about what you see missing from lesbian conversations, Jewish lesbian conversations about literature or not about literature today. What do you yearn to hear more of that you don't see? And Sam, you start us off.
Yeah, I think I'm first of all very curious whether people in a previous time were gathering as Jewish lesbians, and I'm curious to hear from other panelists about this, because I don't think I've ever been part of a specifically Jewish lesbian conversation about literature. And if that's happening somewhere, I would love to join in, but I think I'm part of a lot of queer lit conversations, and then sort of Jewish conversations about Palestine, more so than lit, or sometimes navigating the literary landscape in the current moment. But what I would like to see more of, I think in terms of Jewish literature, I would like to really see a return to questioning. And I think that that might be something we're moving toward, as I think that a lot of the Jewish dominant narratives are kind of coming apart for a lot of people in this moment. And I think I would also like to see a return to humor and camp and irony, and absurdism. I also was thinking a lot about Philip Roth Ellen, and how there was only one review of my book on its publication date, and it was in the LA Review of Books, and they didn't even mention queerness, but they put me sort of in a lineage with Philip Roth, and at first I was really upset by that. And then I returned to Philip Roth and read a few books and realized, like, I feel very happy to be in lineage with and just the questioning of why are we like this, we as Jews, we as Americans, why is society like this, and just the absurdity and the humor and the zaniness that's brought to all of the answers is so great, and something that I aspire to do, and something that I would love to see more of in the world, especially by queer people. And I think in terms of queerness, what I would like to see more of is more sex, honestly, and more like awareness that it's by following our non-normative desires that we are actually seeing other possibilities for being together socially in the world. I would like to, I named Marge Piercy, and I love sort of 70s, 80s feminist utopian lit. And I think we're no longer in this time where we're like, if women were in charge, everything would be different. That was maybe happening back then, but I wonder, like, I think that as queer people, like, we can imagine a little bit, and we can sort of find paths forward, and that's kind of the literature that I'm feeling really interested in right now.
Right. What about you, Sarah? What do you see as missing? What do you yearn for more of?
Well, I think lesbian representation is in pretty bad place right now. And what we don't have are protagonists who are adults. When you ask people, what are the classics of lesbian literature, they'll say, oh, Bastard Out of Carolina, or they'll name like the Alison Bechdel musical, but those are these proto-lesbian girls that have existed happily in literature since Carson McCullers and Harper Lee, but lesbian adults as protagonists and how we view the world is something that's almost non-existent at this moment. The substitution are things like Tar, if you saw that, or I also hated Catherine Daly's biography of X, because these are these extremely powerful lesbian characters. They have all the power in the world and they're totally corrupt. And that's all you get. And those are the rewarded and, representations. And like I was watching Industry on HBO, and it has these like predatory evil lesbians, and one of them actually dies. And I was like, wow, this is so formulaic. So I think we're in a really bad place representationally.
Judith.
No, I was thinking that exact same thing, like grown up lesbians with lives. And it does make me think about Jane Rule. Because I've been thinking a lot about aging, and I've been thinking a lot about women who I know who, well, I guess we're calling it dementia or whatever, but women like my age, which is 73 and older, who their friends, my friends, I am starting to worry about them. And so I was thinking about that very thing. And there's this like thing on Netflix that people are going crazy about, the Gentile woman who falls in love with this rabbi, and was getting like all these like really good reviews, and I'm like going like this and hitting Paula and saying, like, whatever happened to that essay by Riv Ellen Frell from 1973 called Why Jewish Princesses Don't Sweat? It's almost like things that we had been building and built in Sarah, we were building toward what you're talking about. We were in the 70s and 80s and 90s, building toward grown-up lesbians, but some of us are still suffering from that Peter Pan thing of like never growing up. But I agree with you. I would like to see like more, published grown-up girls who like turned into women who have like issues like, oh, I don't know, cancer. I don't know, good lives, like are doing good stuff like what you're doing. And I'm gonna just sort of take a minute too to, I think Joan Nessel is in the rooms here, and Joan published on Facebook something really spectacular a couple of days ago about Palestine, where she connected it to the writing that she did as a younger person. And I thought it was brilliant. And thank you, Joan. I'm going to take this opportunity to say that to you now publicly. And I'm done.
Thanks, Judith. Ellen.
Well, I think in terms of, there are a lot of different yearnings. I mean, at the moment, the situation that we're all in, with this, it's a huge crisis. I think it's probably a major crisis in Jewishness, just outside the lesbian world. But I think we're in one of those upheavals, such as the time when, Sabtai Tzvi was dividing the Jewish world, when you had the appearance of the Enlightenment, the enlightened Jews versus the traditional. I think we are in one of those things where things are buckling underneath. And I think that's something that certainly in the cultural and political conversations, in Edinburgh, we've got this wonderful transgenerational group of, it's a part of Scottish Jews standing with Palestine. I mean, there aren't a lot of Scottish Jews, but it's Jews in Scotland as well, students and things. And, we sort of refer to as the Jewish bloc on the big Palestine demos that happen about every week. And in fact, the reading discussion group, I have to say, Sarah, is, you're next up on the list with the queer, with the Israel-Palestine Queer International book is, everybody's hot, everybody's reading it for like next month. But it's one of those groups that, because it does break down generational walls. I mean, there are people in it, a lot of students, a lot, and then there are oldies, some of us in our 70s and 80s, who have kind of connect with each other in a way that turbo capitalism doesn't really tolerate. I mean, it wants us to be divided generationally. So there's a lot of cross-cultural conversation. I would love to see more of that. I'd like to see that kind of smashing down of the generational ghettos. And I'd like to see it both in fiction and in other forms. So, but in terms of what am I yearning for more of, there's a kind of, I'm always looking for, you know, the great lost lesbian world. So I'm looking particularly for, you know, Jewish language traditions and cultures that are past. You know, that notion that somewhere, I've been studying Yiddish for years and years. It was a family language, but we actually have a group of people who've been studying with a Yiddish teacher for now about 15, 20 years, and it doesn't make us great in Yiddish, but that notion that, you know, we want to, you know, look at things in Yiddish traditions, Ladino, Jewish Arabic, Aramaic, you know, Ethiopian languages, anywhere, you know, that the notion is somewhere back there. You know, I want women's conversations, and I want lesbian conversations. We used to go looking, hopefully, way back in the beginning of dyke hunting in the early 70s, of Ruth and Naomi. They loved each other. They were together, you know. So there's that. And also, I'm also wanting more lesbian voices from out, you know, from the whole outside the contemporary Anglophone Western white tradition. I would like to be seeing, I mean, that's not particularly maybe a Jewish longing, but it's also, it's just hearing more conversations, finding more sort of, you know, kind of compare and contrast exchanges. And so I think that the things I'm really am looking for are perhaps better translations, more research. And it doesn't necessarily have to be fiction. It could be accessible academic scholarship. It could be in poetry. I just want us to get out of that Western, you know, sort of cultural, you know, sort of monoblock that so often it's very hard to escape from, no matter how conscientious you are trying. You know, so it's, you know, you have to be kind of, I suppose, like Indiana Jones, only lesbian and Jewish.
There you go.
Before I go to the next question, I want to lift up from the chat a book someone mentioned, X by Davy Davis. And Sarah, it sounds like you blurbed it. Would you say a word or two about it? And then I'm going to pose the question from the chat to Sam.
It's very innovative. That's enough.
That's okay. Fantastic. X by Davy Davis, very innovative. And then Sam, Libby Klein asks, as someone who also grew up in the Midwest, I've noticed a significant divide in the identities of sexuality and religion, especially in bigger cities. It almost feels like the Midwest would rather handle one identity at a time. How do you think we can continue to blend these worlds so that we can understand both of them better?
So just to be clear, I'm not in the Midwest anymore. And when I grew up in the Midwest, it was, you know, at a time when there was not a single out person that I knew at my school, in my town. And in fact, like no one from my town came out until they graduated college. So I think we were really in this sort of particular self-made Jewish, you know, in my book, I call it the Jew groove. Like it's like this valley that's going to contain all the Jews and you like can't climb out of it. And I kept like thinking that I was climbing out of it, and then it like knocks you back in and you're in Jewish world again. And so I think it was less that I felt othered by being Jewish as much as that I was in, like, it was a very self-imposed sort of fearful community of leaving or of really knowing anyone who wasn't Jewish. And, you know, a lot of our parents were like second generation, and I don't know, that was just how it was. And so, you know, queerness just didn't exist at that time. And now when I go back, I do see queer people walking around and queer couples walking around, and it's like completely amazing to me. But I think, you know, the world has changed and there's space for queer people within that community now.
Thank you. We're going to start with Ellen for the last question and run down and end with Sam. I also want to say Sarah just put a link in the chat to her book coming out in April. And Sarah, I cannot tell you how much it thrills me to see more of your books coming out from commercial publishing, because I feel like you helped make that revolution possible. And although I have tons of gripes about commercial publishing, I want them to do everything right by you. So do advance order Sarah's book. But the final question is, what is igniting you right now that you're reading or that you've read recently? What's igniting you? Another way of asking it might be, what is giving you hope? Ellen.
Okay, well, what's really setting the heather on fire for me right now is not necessarily, I mean, there are some very interesting pieces of fiction coming out. I wouldn't say necessarily lesbian fiction, but I really loved Elif Shafak's English language novel. She's a Turkish writer, now lives in the UK, and has sometimes been translated, has now been written something in English called There Are Rivers in the Sky. And so it might be very heretical putting her in here because I don't know what her sexuality is. I suppose I should, but I'm out of the old publishing gossip networks. So I think it's a nice bonus, though. I want to see, that old Jewish grandmother thing, here's somebody who's done something good. Isn't it wonderful? They're Jewish. Hooray. We all ship nachas from that. But one of the things, I think, different kinds of narrative, different ways of storytelling, which I guess is another bit of heresy about, I should be talking here about proper fiction and so on. Last night, I was at the Scottish Storytelling Centre, was doing an event on the theme of refugees and immigrants into Scotland, given this is a period when a lot of people are fleeing and being driven out of a lot of places. And I was reading a couple of poems, and we were doing kind of words and music evening. And one of the people who was there was a young Persian, an Iranian woman who was singing a ballad in a sort of Azerbaijani Persian dialect, and the storytelling knocked my socks off. It was just, she told very, very concisely the story of what the ballad, it was a kind of lost love and yearning. It was, heterosexual. It wasn't particularly even lesbian, but it was performed in a very kind of, this woman whose voice living in Iran has been suppressed. Her, she's had to come away to be able to just stand up and be a singer. She comes from this incredibly officially misogynist, theocratic culture, and sang this song of learning, of yearning and love. And it was because of who she was, where she'd come from, her backstory, and her gorgeous voice. It's like there wasn't a dry eye in the house. I mean, I have a musician friend who I collaborate with a lot, kind of heterosexual guy in his 50s, wonderful worldly musician, but both of us looked at each other and everybody was the tears were coming down from everybody as we all looked across the stage. I mean, it was so moving. And I thought, it could be long fiction, short fiction, it could be music, it could be a painting, but I want that kind of kick in the stomach.
Thank you so much, Ellen. What about you, Judith?
Well, I was very much knocked up by the Safe Keep. But I can never say her last name. Yael Vandervoorden, who's an Israeli Dutch author, and it's a kind of remarkable novel. I don't know how she did it. It's kind of like a magic trick to me. And another book that really gave me hope is Tommy Orange's book, Wandering Stars, and my old pal Andrea Hairston's very large novel called Archangels of Funk, which is probably the only speculative fiction sci-fi novel since Marge Piercy that I've been able to read and understand, because it takes place in the Pioneer Valley in the kind of near future. And in terms of music, Alicia Spiegels, who I believe is a Jewish lesbian, has a new CD out. I think it's called Fiddle of Fire. She used to be the violinist for the Plasmatics. And that's been really kind of giving me a kick in the butt while I'm writing. So that's what's going on. And I think conversations like this and Sinister Wisdom and occasional, well, actually pretty regular phone calls from Julie Enzer kind of give me a lot of hope, the direction that Sinister Wisdom is going in. And also, I just want to say, Sarah, directly to you, that I really want to acknowledge exactly what Julie said, that the kind of body of your work, the has been really inspirational, that you keep doing it and you keep making it and you keep kind of kicking my butt or our butt into kind of thinking about stuff that we maybe don't want to think about. even in your novels, stuff I don't want to think about, but I do. And I just am really appreciative, actually, of the other three of you panelists. And Sam, like I said to you before, I feel like those short stories really thrilled me. They made me so hopeful about younger than me people writing really good work. So thank you. I'm done.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Judith.
Val.
Sarah?
Well, the best book I read this year is Minor Detail by Adania Shibli. She's a Palestinian novelist. And here, she addresses it formally. So she shows you how Palestinians are living in the past and the present simultaneously. The best Jewish lesbian book I read this year was a really extraordinary book by Gwen Strauss. It's not what you think it is. It's about two women who met in Ravensbrück, but it's all about how the left functioned inside concentration camps and how they maintain their sectarianism. It's fascinating. It's an incredible piece of left history. It's incredibly well written, and it's these two women just, cross there. But as a person who spent my whole life reading about the Holocaust, this book was filled with stuff I didn't know.
It's great. Sam?
Can you tell us the title again, Sarah?
Yeah, it's called Milena Margarita, Love Story, Ravensbrück. It's a terrible title, but it's by Gwen Strauss, and I just put the link in the chat.
I'm gonna say two books, one by a Jewish queer person, is Clement Goldberg's New Mistakes, which does have adult lesbians in it, and is the first book out on Dopamine, Michelle T's new imprint. And it's a book that I really love because I think that I'm really loving work right now that has an awareness of the structural violence and the intensity of what we're all living in, but that opens up something or makes the world feel more expansive. And this book is like that. There is kind of an odd collection of neighbors who can suddenly hear plants talking and cats talking and follow mysterious orbs and are just kind of following their desire, following curiosity, and the non-human world is opening up to them in all of these ways and kind of whispering of revolution from knowledges beyond the human. And I feel like I'm going out into the world feeling a more expansive sense of possibility and attunement to all the things that might be communicating with me. The other book I'll name is Camila Sosa Viada's I'm a Fool to Want You. She is an Argentinian trans woman telenovela star who also writes novels, and also has these very adult characters who I think that something in common with both books is that people are really kind to each other. And I think, Sarah, that I've noticed that too, that like the mainstream publishers are really like publishing lesbian literature where it's like not feminist anymore. It's like lesbians can be awful women too. And so I think like I'm really loving seeing these queer books where queerness really is a refuge and where people are finding spaces of love and possibility together.
Awesome. Thank you, Sam. And in response, we will try to call all of the book recommendations and put them in the email that we send out with the follow-up video. I want to thank all of our fantastic panelists for this evening. Ellen Golfer, Judith Katz, Sarah Schulman, Sam Cohn. It's really wonderful to hear you all in dialogue together. Thank you to the Jewish Women's Archive for co-sponsoring this event. And to everyone who joined us this evening, it is wonderful to be with you all and think with you all. We will make the video available at the Sinister Wisdom website tomorrow or Thursday. We're putting the link into the chat. We have more fall Zoom goodness happening on Thursday, November 12th. We will be doing our calendar launch, talking about the art of Sinister Wisdom, a calendar celebration. You can learn more about our events at sinisterwisdom.org/events. But before we wrap up, we dance. Max, share the song. We will highlight people dancing, and when the song ends, I will end the Zoom. Thank you all.